our colleague and sister Renee isn't here today, but we are thinking about you, girlfriend, as you are working that midterm grading load that I know you're doing. And I just wanted to say hello, everyone. I'm Annalisa. I'm coming at you from LA. We're so lucky to have with us Myung and Rose today from AF3IRM Bay-Area. And we are hoping to really round out our celebration of women, which, as we say, should last every day, but which we really highlighted this month of March. And so I just kind of want to open it up with my sisters, Melissa.
Hey, from Central Florida.
And Gabby.
Hello, everyone from Houston, Texas.
It's hot down south. That's what we were saying right before we started. So welcome, everyone. And I'm actually going to turn it over just to you, Riss, to introduce yourself, and then Rose, and then we'll kind of get into this conversation, because I know that AF3IRM is a transnational feminist organization, and you have a million chapters across the United States, and growing, and really looking at the basic masses and the work that women are doing in all of these different areas. So we're glad to have you here, and I'd love for you just to introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction with AF3IRM and for having Rose and I on this call. So I'm Riss. I am part of the SFA chapter of AF3IRM, dedicated to the struggle of women's liberation and the fight against oppression in all its forms. I'm also a member of the World Without Exploitation Youth Coalition. Yeah, so that's me. Rose?
Oh, great.
Yeah, hi, I'm Rose. I'm a lot newer to AF3IRM and the sex trade abolitionist circles in general than Riss is. Yeah, she's basically a senior organizer at this point, even though we're the same age. But we both go to UC Berkeley. I'm in Southeast Asian Studies and Human Rights. And I've been in various political organizations throughout my college career. But yeah, it's pretty recent that I started centering feminism and issues like this in my work and everything I do. But I feel like the stars are definitely aligning with this shift in consciousness and everything. So I'm really happy to be here.
Great. We're going to get back to that, because we're very interested in that shift of consciousness as well, as we move towards, not just kind of a liberation from all forms of oppression, but all types of liberation. So let's just start. We have been reading a lot about what has happened in Atlanta. Last week, we talked about it a little. But it's what's happened, I think, out of those Atlanta discussions is this whole deep discussion around the sex trade and around, this kind of battle between, should we regulate it more? Should we decriminalize it? Should we legalize it? And there's a lot of should we's there, and there's a lot of different perspectives. And this is becoming more and more central to feminist circles and transnational feminist movements. So I'd love to kind of hear your take on that.
Yeah, so for me, I think what happened at Atlanta was racial femicide, where white men kill women of color. And I feel like it's important to not skirt around that language, and that it's not a sex addiction or bad days that kill women, it's men that kill women. And I think it's a reminder that we still live under patriarchy, and it's a reminder of male violence against women. And so when institutions of power refuse to say those things, it's like a systemic gaslighting, like turning their eyes away from what we know, live, and experience every single waking day. And then they'll only maybe look at us when we die. So from womb to tomb, we are commodified. And I think it's just a heavy reminder of that.
Yeah, and I also want to say that I'm so happy that these discussions are happening, but it's pretty funny that it started because these false claims were being passed around in the mass media and around social media that the slain women are Asian elders were sex workers. And it was completely baseless, but it just points to the extent to which Asian women are fetishized in Western society. And I think that's a really important conversation to have too. Yeah.
And I think to the point what you're saying, Annalisa, I think it's really frustrating how organizations will profit off of people's death and be like, here's how we can use it as a motto and a mascot to push our political agenda, such as like full decriminalization of the sex trade and so on and so forth. Like, we can't catch a break. We fight till our deaths when we're alive, and then when we die, people co-opt our meanings and existences to push for their neoliberal agendas, which is so frustrating.
Yeah, I also felt, that frustration, and for, folks that are watching out there, full decriminalization of the sex trade refers to, totally decriminalizing not just victims and survivors of the sex trade, but also Johns, also pimps, also traffickers. And, I have been in my own work accused of being a carceral feminist because I believe that, I'm sorry, if you sell people, if you are engaging in the flesh trade, yeah, you have to go to jail, or there has to be some kind of consequence. And, this idea that this is something survivors are calling for. I've worked in human trafficking since 1993, and before we even called it trafficking. And I will tell you that I've never heard a survivor say, let's go easier on a trafficker. It's just a very, I think, subject where, it's kind of like, I think one of your sisters in AF3IRM said this, and it's something that Gabby and I have really been talking about, like, are we fighting the sex trade or are we not? So, how can we have harm reduction on the terrain of women's bodies? We just can't. I don't see it.
That's the gaslighting, right? That's the two sides. But you're not even sure like what side you're looking at. Is this the actual, is this authentically kind? Is this authentically like you're trying to help me? Or is this like you're trying to help me because you've got another side, you've got something else coming? And how do we know? How do we detect that this is gaslighting? And even to say it just, with you all, but actually have somebody go through it and recognize what's happening is so traumatic to them, thinking about their past and what could be their future. You're testing everything that they know, because that's what this is. This is their life.
Yeah, you said something, Riss, that struck me, and Melissa, you just said it again. You said systemic gaslighting. Can you guys talk a little bit more about that?
Rose, did you want to go? I feel like I've been talking.
You go ahead, because Riss actually just published an article earlier this week on Sway Media on this topic, and she used systemic gaslighting, and that was my introduction to this concept, but it makes so much sense. We women, Asian women, all women really face this stuff like every single day, where our problems are belittled. Yeah, I think you'll do a better job of explaining it than me.
Yeah, so for me, I first decided to use the word systemic gaslighting because I feel like for example, honing in on the Atlanta tragedy, people will just see it as one man acting out his ideology and not the systems behind it that are intersected and what he represents. So like, for example, the institution of male violence against women rests on misogyny, and it's a hierarchy that necessitates power and control over women through violence in many forms, like psychological, economic, political, physical, and so on. And so murder is the ultimate form of power control that acts out that ideology. And so when I see police and Georgia officials dismissing and not even acknowledging it as like a hate crime, it's the utter denial and refusal to recognize that these institutions do not protect us, they profit from us. And so it's like saying, when you try to voice yourself, like, this is what we're experiencing, it's like there's just close our eyes, you know, because like you can't even name it. If you can't even name it, you can't even start acknowledging it and start reparations from there.
Mhm.
And that's what was so hurtful from the tragedy that happened last week. Language matters. And to say it was a bad day and to dismiss, first of all, it was centered on the white murderer's story versus the stories of the slain woman. That was already an issue, like the point of view of what media was highlighting. And then to just say it was simply a bad day, it was just like a lack of acknowledgement of the systemic issues that have led to this ideology that was acted out. Because the murderer, I called him a white terrorist, he is not just one person. That represents a community of people who have benefited from these systems. And to not call it out, I think sends a message where it's okay to have this ideology.
Yeah, and I mean, I think one of the big pieces that AF3IRM has really brought strongly to the table is this idea that the bodies of human beings, should not be commodified, period. And I just kind of want to ask, like, how has it been, to be an activist, to be a woman, a young woman in this world where the louder voices, they're not even, as I said earlier, the majority, but louder voices are calling for things like sex work, or calling for things like, not just full decriminalization, but legalization. How's that been for the both of you to kind of operate in that space?
Take it away, Rose.
I just want to mention real quick that I think it's just part of this work to have to fight these systems of oppression, fight men, and fight these louder voices. But what kind of hurts or is more emotionally taxing is when we have to fight other feminists and have to fight other women who, like, for our stance. You know what I mean? Like, Riss and I have been talking a lot about this concept of horizontal hostility. We've both been reading Audre Lorde, and she talks a little bit about this, but just like, where are we as women, like, directing our rage and our aggression? Like, it shouldn't be towards each other. Like, we should be fighting like the vertical systems of power that are oppressing us. But, for example, like after Riss published her article, this other Asian American woman, like a colleague of hers, her takeaway from it, like completely dismissing like the main point, completely missing it, attacked her on this like sex trade abolitionist stance. And it's just, I don't know, it's kind of like hard to fight other women. It's because like you should recognize that like we're fighting for the same thing. Like we want collective liberation for all women, and like when we take this stance on the abolition of the sex trade, for example, like we're fighting for the sex workers. Like we're fighting for them just like you are.
Right.
It's a little
exactly. And like, just to add on to yours, like to fight the sex work is work message is to realize that we are critiquing patriarchy, white supremacy, and capitalism, not those in the sex trade. It's like how we're saying we're trying to dismantle capitalism, but no way are we critiquing, shaming, or criminalizing those in the working class. And I feel like people like liberal feminists believe that when I say sex work is not work, it must mean that I'm harming them, stigmatizing them, or pushing for their criminalization, when it's none of those. But when we critique capitalism, we all know that we're critiquing not the working exploited class, but the top 1% and the systemic forces that create these stark wealth disparities. Yet when it comes to the sex industry, if I dare say those who are being bought and sold are being exploited, I'm supposedly victim blaming them. Mm-hmm. Why does this happen? Why, when all I want is women to be liberated from the economic conditions that coerce them into a trade that profits off of the US history of exploiting women's bodies from womb to tomb. So I have to be very clear that when I say that as transnational feminists, when we critique the sex trade, we're critiquing the sex buyers, the pimps, the johns, the brothel owners, and the traffickers, and the structural forces that arose through history to create the conditions that see our bodies directly as commodities. And I'm arguing that the shame and stigma should belong to them and not those being exploited. But this isn't the immediate train of thought for example, liberal feminists or those in academic institutions, which is so frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, the regular form of thought or the normative form of thought is like, well, you know, shouldn't we try to help where we can? Because we're never going to get rid of the sex trade. And what is, you know, what are the ways that we, you know, who have a different, you know, stance around this, what are the ways that we can fight all of these different types of, you know, these different types of systems and structures that are holding patriarchy, misogyny, capitalism, imperialism, and white supremacy in place. I mean, I think that there are, you know, youth, women, you know, across the board that are really looking for what can they do.
Yeah, and because Riz brought this up, I just want to mention that it's so important to bring an anti-capitalist lens when you're talking about issues of the sex trade, because yeah, class analysis is so important when it comes to this, because our work as transnational feminists means that we're fighting for women in the global South, for example, that don't have the same platforms as, I don't know, like the cam girls and porn stars in the West have. And for me, growing up in Thailand, for example, like I knew since I was very little, like seeing these systems at work, like my family lives very close to the center of the sex industry in Thailand. And, you know, like from a very young age, I just intuitively knew that this isn't how it's supposed to be. And that exploitation is what I'm fighting for. And so I've always felt very disconnected from the individualist framing, you know, of like Western white liberal feminism. And so finally feeling like I found community and found like what I want to work, like the issues that I want to work towards is like very liberating for me personally too.
Right.
Well, I think that this is the time, because as you know, some of us may have recognized and seen and you know, seen this as we were growing up. We may not have been around communities to support, and you may have had ideas but no words to say them, like no, you know, why is this happening? You know, it's capitalism, it's this, it's that, but you're noticing it and you know it doesn't sit right with you, but that's about all, you know, that's as big as the seed can grow. But then you all of a sudden start to, you know, you get watered and you get food and you're like, oh wait, no, there are other people around here that have the same view, and now we can band together. So I think this is absolutely timely, and I'm sorry that it took this long. For, you know, Annalise has been working on this for decades.
But I think it's really important too, because like even myself, I didn't really identify myself as a feminist until I came across organizing spaces and sisterhood like AF3IRM, because I've seen in like high school feminists carry a very individual Western lens of like what feminism means to them. For example, like talking about individual empowerment and agency, even if another woman is being oppressed. Like in my view, if one person is being oppressed, not all of us are free, but all individual like Western feminists care about is their own individual autonomy and not collective liberation. And because feminism looks differently for different people, my default like image of now of a feminist is like this mostly affluent white woman in the global North. And so that's why I never really like identified myself as a feminist until I came across transnational anti-imperialist feminism, which centered the most disenfranchised women, especially those in the global South.
Yeah, and when we're talking about the sex trade, especially this narrative that prioritizes individual agency and individual bodily autonomy and all of that, it tends to ignore the coercive social and economic forces which push people into the sex trade in the first place as a means for survival, because they have to commodify their own bodies to survive at the bottom of this capitalist order, which gives them no other choice.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
That reminds me of the talk that I attended with World Without Exploitation and Esperanza as part of AF3IRM.
Yes.
And speaking, and she, Esperanza was arguing like poverty like conditions is a form of coercion. And that's something that I think the West hasn't recognized yet. They're not there yet. And so like what policies and structures can we do to shift that thinking?
Right. I feel like,
oh, go ahead. No, go ahead, Riz.
Okay. I feel like a lot, like right now, it's very popular and mainstream to be like anti-capitalist. But if people were truly anti-capitalist, they would realize that they would need to abolish the sex trade, because poverty is what drives women into, because they have been pushed out of any other like economic opportunity. They don't have intergenerational wealth or connections and networking, you know? And so I feel like when people talk about like the sex trade, they need to also acknowledge like imperialism, because it's also the US military that is over exploiting our mother countries, and the massage parlors and like the businesses that pop up to cater and appeal to the comfort to the US soldiers. And it's important to know that the sex buyers are also in the military, the men in green who kill and rape us in our motherlands, painting the red and the red, white, and blue. No one talks about that.
Yeah, and if you know, this is one of the things like all over the media when they talk about like the fetishization of, you know, Asian and API communities and women, like where does that come from? That comes from the I mean, you know, a lot of that comes from these militarized spaces, and can be traced back to that. You know, I was gonna say something in relation to something that, you know, you were all saying earlier, and that was also in this kind of individualized construct of choice, you know, this fake construct of choice or empowerment, et cetera. We often also hear the narrative about, you know, toxic masculinity, and also like how you know, enlightened men can you know, change their individual actions. And again, it's predicated on this type of individualism as opposed to saying patriarchy and misogyny. And I think that, you know, the power of words, as you were saying earlier, Gabby, and how we're using these words and wielding them is so critical right now.
Yeah, and real quick, Riss, because Riss speaks on this so eloquently. If when you're talking about systemic forces, you need to talk about the unholy trinity of oppression. Am I right?
Yes, the unholy trinity of oppression is capitalism, white supremacy, and patriarchy. Yeah. And I feel like people see them as occurring in a vacuum, so ignoring the material reality about how they actually affect women of color, or they come across it as they don't see the interconnection of like how those three lie at and those three is exactly how and where the sex trade lies, the intersection of all three of them. But people don't have that class analysis or see how they intersect. And because of that, the dominant narrative and status quo is still allowed to perpetuate.
Yeah. All right, so we could keep going, but it's that time. And, you know, we've been wanting to really end with giving folks some real tools and direction, and or maybe even some resources. What can people do and what should they be doing? Yeah, I'll throw it over to you guys.
I guess number one is to organize. So if you would like to join or firm or transnational anti-imperialist sisterhood, definitely reach out to us, like in the comments or what be it. I think to also realize that, at least for me, coming from an academic background, I feel like it's very trained to just debate topics that I have no fundamental basis or experiences of. So I hope people understand that playing devil's advocacy or arguing is not true advocacy. Organizing is the true form of advocacy. So to just allow yourself to not to immediately start debating about topics and trying to make a point, to just listen to other people, which is like the core of organizing. And then third is to also just read texts from revolutionary feminists. I feel like it's very easy to feel hopeless or to get caught up in neoliberal ideology if you are not able to see or imagine a world where patriarchy did not exist. Like patriarchy took place over a series of years. It was not one single event that created the conditions we live in today. So reading like Gruner Lerner's The Creation of Patriarchy and so many other revolutionary like feminists like Thomas Sankara, I think would really allow us to dare to daydream beyond like the constraints that we live in.
Yeah, I think what's been so inspiring for me is, for example, I was just listening to this talk by Grace Lee Boggs and Angela Davis the other day, and she was talking about what Riss was just saying, like the importance of reimagining what our future looks like, because the work of abolition, the work of organizing and activism isn't destructive. We're trying to rebuild. So we have to, like intersect philosophy and activism so that we can like hold that space and have the capacity to work towards what we see as collective liberation.
Right.
All right, Gabby, Melissa, last words.
My call to action is to definitely read Riss's op-ed on Sway. I posted it in our comments, and also to read on Equality Model US, sponsored by World Without Exploitation. That's one of, and I think it's also in your op-ed, if I recall correctly, Riss, the link to just learn about imagine a world without patriarchy. Let's leave it at that. Yeah.
There's also the Land Embodies Back model, too. It's also in the op-ed, so different alternative solutions as well.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone. I'm just going to close. And actually, both Rose and Riss, you reminded me of how powerful it is to stay grounded and rooted in the education of revolution. And, I know when I was an organizer, that was one of the most important pieces, was to have these educational discussions with the people that you're organizing with. To be able to always be studying the concrete conditions of where you're working in. And this is also in part a shout out to the Keeping It 100 women that have been meeting every Sunday to talk about emergent strategy. So I just want to read a piece from Adrienne Marie Brown. We're creating a world that we want to see. We're whispering it to each other, cuddled in the dark, and we are screaming it at people who are so scared of it that they dress themselves in war regalia to turn and face us. Because of our ancestors, because of us, and because of the children that we are raising, there will be a future without police and prisons. Yes, there will be a future without rape, without harassment and constant fear and childhood sexual assault, a future without hunger or violence and with abundance, where gender is a joyful spectrum, where each of our bodies is treated like sacred ground, centering ourselves and centering marginalized communities. We are the center of this story. And I want to thank the both of you for, telling this perspective and for speaking out so courageously. And quite frankly, for me, giving hope to what comes next. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.